Hello, everybody, and welcome to Brookings. My name is Jonathan Rauch. I'm a senior fellow in governance studies. I'm a co-author on both of the papers we're releasing today, but I'm taking off that hat and acting as moderator for both of our panels today. We've been running at Brookings a program about legalization of marijuana now since October of 2012, before it started in Colorado and Washington. And we're doing something different from what pretty much anyone else is. We're not looking at public health and criminal justice, and we're not arguing for or against legalization. We're taking legalization as a fact. We're saying it is happening, likely or not, like it or not, and it's likely to continue. California may well legalize this November, which would mean the entire West Coast would have legal recreational marijuana. So that's premise number one. And premise number two is that how you do this matters at least as much as whether you do it. Implementation matters a lot. So we focus on the day two agenda, which is after the election. What happens next? How do you set up the bureaucracies, cope with the challenges of governance? We also see marijuana legalization as the most important public policy reform in the country right now, or perhaps tied with Obamacare. But in terms of its implications for government, major reform and major policies, it's just absolutely huge. So we're studying all of those aspects and have been for a while. We're very grateful to Phil Harvey of the DKT Liberty Project and the Charles G. Koch Foundation, among others, who've supported this work on marijuana policy and the work that we're unveiling today, which are a couple of papers both on the themes of big marijuana. Clearly, one of the most important pressing topics, maybe the biggest topic, is the fact that for the first time in American history, you're going to see corporate marijuana, which means you're going to see lobbying and you're going to see marketing and you're going to see the profit motive engaged in a big way. We decided to try to think that through a bit. You all, I hope, have copies of the two papers that we're issuing today, trying to think through sort of first steps to think through both those issues. What we're doing today is two back-to-back panels. Both are brief panels. The format's going to be the same, which is try to keep it conversational, keep opening statements short, lots of back and forth, and move briskly, and keep it moving briskly is my job. Panel number one. I'm delighted to, we have some amazing people on both these panels, but I'm delighted to introduce three fantastic people. Well, four, beginning with my colleague Phil Wallach, co-author of the paper Bootleggers, Baptists, Bureaucrats, and Bongs, How Interest Group Politics Will Shape Marijuana Regulation. Phil's a senior fellow here in governance studies and the author most recently of To the Edge, Legality, Legitimacy, and the Responses to the 2008 Financial Crisis. He'll do a quick overview of our findings. Next to him is Andrew Friedman, who is the Director of Marijuana Coordination for the state of Colorado, works for Governor Hickenlooper. He's a native of Colorado. He's also a graduate of Harvard Law School, though no one is perfect. Sorry, I can't help it. We're especially grateful to you for coming all this way to be with us, all the way from Denver. Kathleen Friedel is a prize-winning historian and is the author of, among other things, this magnificent book, The Drug Wars in America, 1940 to 1973, published in 2013. It's a synoptic view of the drug wars, and she's also the author of the history, the GI Bill. Finally, at the far end of the table, my friend Alex Tabarrok, who is a professor of economics at George Mason University and also the director of the Center for the Study of Public Choice, which is very relevant because one of the things that we're doing in this first paper is a public choice analysis of marijuana legalization. And to explain what that's all about, Phil, over to you.
All right, well, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks to all of you for being here today.
I'm sorry to interrupt. We also, those of you out there in Webland, hashtag, if you want to tweet a question, hashtag big marijuana.
All right. So as Jonathan told you, our paper is called Bootleggers, Baptists, Bureaucrats, and Bongs. We're responsible for just two of those alliterative Bs. The first two come from a famous little paper by a regulatory economist named Bruce Yandel, who worked in the public choice tradition that thinks about politics as serving interests. This way of thinking sometimes gets people surprisingly riled up, as if discussing the role of interest groups brings to light some scandalous revelation about the policymaking process. We don't see it that way at all. Politics is quintessentially about the balancing of interests, and so there's nothing scandalous or surprising about saying that a given policy area is shaped by some interests. But oftentimes people do think about issues in other terms, which policies are efficient or just or fair, without thinking about how deviations from those ideals might be serving the interests of particular groups. So, what you're all here for, marijuana. Our paper tries to understand how the shape of the interest group landscape has affected policy as 4 states and the District of Columbia have moved toward legalization, and how it will affect policy going forward from here. So public choice economics help us to understand why changing any policy is likely to be hard. Entrenched groups fight to keep what they have, and groups that would be well served by a different policy regime are often unable to organize. And yet change did happen in marijuana policy, a remarkable change in which the boundaries of the conversation have dramatically shifted. Why did that happen? Well, for many years, the marijuana policy debate was dominated by 3 kinds of anti-legalization groups. First, the Baptists, moralists and public health advocates who believe marijuana use is wrong or harmful. Second, the bootleggers, commercial and gray market interests who directly benefited from continued prohibition, including medical marijuana sellers enjoying a larger customer base than they might otherwise have if they had to compete with recreational sellers, and mandatory treatment providers. And third, the bureaucrats, law enforcement and quasi-governmental entities whose budgets and missions are sustained by the war on drugs. Those interests combined firepower, retarded change even as public support for marijuana prohibition softened. Reformers managed to disrupt that equilibrium by reframing the way that the public understands the status quo's costs and benefits. They did that in the late 2000s through a shrewdly crafted campaign that aimed money and argumentation at the incumbent coalition's weakest points and changed the terms of debate. In particular, an increasingly professionalized cadre of reformers shifted the public's focus from the harms of marijuana use to the harms of marijuana criminalization, especially for low-income and minority communities. The reformers caught their opposition largely off guard. They were comfortable in assuming the old status quo would persist. And the reformers managed to co-opt some of their potential opponents by giving them privileged access to the new system, as in the case of Colorado medical marijuana dispensaries, or by cutting them checks, as in the case of Washington's public health community that was promised dedicated revenue streams from marijuana taxes. And the reformers managed to portray their movement as one being waged on behalf of the public's general interest. Already we're starting to see how those victories could be self-limiting. The rise of commercial marijuana interest and a potentially controversial marijuana lobby may impede legalization's momentum as its opponents change the subject once again, from the harms of criminalization to the harms of corporate predation, a subject which our second panel today is going to focus on. In some ways, the most interesting questions about how interests play into marijuana legalization are about the period after, when it becomes a regulatory policy area complete with arcane rules about licensing and taxes. Over the past few years, regulators in the vanguard states have enjoyed an extraordinary amount of freedom to craft rules governing the new market. The public has zoomed out. They tend not to pay very much attention to these detailed matters. The old prohibitionist interests are discombobulated, and the new commercial marijuana interests are still getting organized. But that situation probably won't last. Over time, multiple interests are sure to coalesce and colonize the regulatory process. Despite widely touted concerns that one or more disproportionately powerful players will come to dominate the regulatory system, we think regulatory incoherence should be a greater concern than regulatory capture. That is, we worry as much about misregulation that ill serves the public interest as we do about systematic under-regulation. We don't suggest any prescription that will somehow make the world of legalized marijuana free of interest groups' influence. No such thing exists. But we do think that the emerging decentralized model of state-level regulation offers an appealing way to proceed in the regulation of recreational marijuana. State-level regulation allows room for experimentation, limits the stakes of any misstep, and spreads out the resources of interest groups, preventing them from concentrating their firepower and securing nationwide monopoly rents. Our paper offers some other gentle prescriptions for managing the influence of interest groups, and we hope you read it. But we really think that having some awareness about the issues that attach to the influence of interest groups is really half of the battle as we try to figure out what a good regulatory regime looks like in this policy area. So I'll leave it at that for now and look forward to the discussion with the other panelists.
Thank you, Andrew. Your thoughts?
Well, first, it's just an honor to be here. I tell most groups that I was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff before this, and my mom was really proud, and she'd tell everybody that her son was Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff, and now that I'm the world's first marijuana czar, she tells everybody that I'm the Lieutenant Governor's Chief of Staff. But this might actually go up on the rank of she might even brag about me a little bit after this one. I find this to be an extraordinarily insightful paper, so first of all, thank you. I'm at the rare place where I actually don't have to think much about should we legalize or not. That question was answered for me by the voters of Colorado. And so the most interesting part for me was to think through why we're in the honeymoon period we are regulatorily. So that's what I have a few thoughts on that. I actually didn't know, so thank you. It's sad to know it's going to go away, but important as well, I guess, on this one. And let me give some examples of why I think I've seen this in real life, and I think we've seen it start to go away already. And so the first would be edibles. We start off with edibles when the market opened. They were much more popular in recreational than we anticipated. They were less popular in medical. And of course, there were a few opening tragedies that were related to edibles, and probably most notably Levi Tomby, who fell from a hotel roof and died. What was remarkable is that I called up the industry groups immediately after that, and they full-heartedly agreed in emergency rulemaking and to change dosing requirements for edibles, even though they had all spent an enormous amount of money on the edible equipment that existed already. So in that you could see, and every time we had a regulatory meeting on it, there was 10 cameras, and the New York Times reported on it, and the Denver Post, and anybody who anybody knew everything going on in those meetings. Now we are dealing with a pesticides problem, and frankly, probably a more systematic and more worrisome problem in a lot of ways, because the emergency doesn't come up right away. It's going to be 10 years from now, you'll see a statistical blip in cancer rates or birth defects, and it's much harder to deal with the industry in this way, and they've been much more combative. They've provided their own and what I would say scientifically unsound solutions a lot of the time. The industry is torn apart. Some people want higher regulation in this area, and some people want a lot less regulation. There's a lot of confusion, and there's a lot more mistrust. And so it's been interesting to watch where at first we all were very much problem solvers together. The much more typical government regulation versus industry battlegrounds have started to come up, particularly around pesticides. The other thing I found interesting in the paper worth talking about is this worry over regulation, because I see that a little bit in tension with I kind of want to take advantage of this honeymoon period to run what might be left of it to run as fast as possible with regulation, knowing that it's going to be so much harder later on to enforce new regulations, especially as business models grow up around what we're doing and people start making capital investments. I'd much rather lay groundwork right now, and that's difficult because we have very little data right now. And so we might suppose that something is going to be a big problem because we can draw a few anecdotes out, or we can just use some common sense, but the industry really wants hard data, and I think good governance would probably want hard data. And so how to draw the line between what is overregulation and what's running as fast as possible, as smart as possible, to create a good guideline for later on. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to think about with the warnings towards the back of this paper. And then finally, what I find interesting about the dynamics that set up this anti versus pro, legalization versus anti-legalization mindset is I don't know quite how to kind of co-opt the anti-legalization people to be part of a good governance model later on. So I'm found a lot of the times I'm in a battle with anti-legalization people where I think they should be helping me on advertising restrictions or on smart policy about caregivers and how to limit the gray market. And instead, I find myself to be more of a proxy for a national battle of whether or not legalization is a good idea. And so what I hope to draw, again, also from this paper is how do we get to a point where when legalization is no longer the question, how do these groups then recoalesce more around what is it that makes good government? How do you achieve your goals now that legalization is simply part of the landscape? So thank you for the very thoughtful paper.
Thank you. What do you, if you were projecting another 5 years into the future, I guess you've been into this experiment now 4 years. In the next 4 to 5 years, what do you imagine the regulatory environment will look like, if you had to guess?
Boy, that's a tough one. Assuming that we are pretty much still just a state-based model and the national regulatory regulations haven't come in, I think the big pieces have been moved at this point. And so I believe that what we found on pesticides will be much more like what we see on the day-to-day battles, that we will now, what has been a very transparent, open process of debating what are good regulations will become more and more closed off from each other. We'll have to really battle to keep those connections going. I'm hoping it's not the case, but I think there'll be more distance and more of a frenemy structure with industry groups than there is currently, which I would say was actually a friendship structure.
So more friction, more resistance, just a bit harder to move stuff around.
Yeah, and consolidated voices amongst the industry itself, which right now we have 4 industry groups, which is a lot of industry groups for a $1 billion market. I think those voices are going to find more cohesion along the way.
Will you lose flexibility in terms of working with the legislature, which has been pretty responsive the first couple of years?
The last years has shown, yeah, that people will find their own avenues. They're also growing their own expertise, and so before, as we come, very trusted voice, and I think still a trusted voice, but they're starting to kind of listen in other places as well.
Thank you so much. Kathleen?
Thank you. I want to join Andrew in encouraging everyone to read this wonderful paper. I learned a tremendous amount from reading it, and congratulations to both Phil and Jonathan for a really useful and I think important contribution to marijuana legalization. I want to identify myself not as a disinterested scholar of marijuana legalization, but as a full-throated advocate of marijuana legalization, and that should couch my remarks. Hopefully they'll be persuasive to others as well. I just have a couple of points that I'd like to raise and kind of describe in paragraph form. The first is, Phil and Jonathan chose a public choice framework to explain and couch their intervention. And in the opening paragraphs of their paper, they say that this may not be the best framework to explain a lot of different political issues, among them, for instance, abortion politics. Well, as somebody who's published on Catholic hospitals, I can tell you that, in fact, public choice may not be the best framework for cultural grievance politics, but it is, in fact, a neglected one. And we could actually do a lot more work on public choice theory when it comes to cultural grievance politics, and in particular, politics of white backlash. And I make that observation to introduce kind of my first quibble with the paper, which is its treatment of Washington, D.C. Jonathan was nice enough to mention my book in his introduction of me, and people who are historians of the drug war ought to know, as this drug war historian knows, that Washington, D.C. played a special role in the formation of the drug war. Mandatory minimums were first introduced here. No-knock search authority was first introduced here. Asset forfeiture was first introduced here. And I raise this to say the paper's treatment of Washington, D.C. is somewhat surprising in my eyes, because it's Washington, D.C. is presented as having opted for home grow. But as Washington, D.C. Legalization advocates know, in fact, Washington, D.C. would have liked to have, first of all, put a system of taxation on the ballot itself. But because Washington, D.C. is still kind of governed by a racist architecture, we are not allowed to vote on fiduciary concerns in our popular measures. So we first of all would have liked to put a tax and spend measure on the ballot, but we are constitutionally prohibited from doing that. And second of all, when the marijuana legalization initiative passed in Washington, D.C., which it did in overwhelming numbers in every precinct in the city except for one, Congress intervened, in particular Republicans in the House of Representatives intervened, and prevented this city from implementing the measure in the way that it would have liked through its public representatives by inserting a rider in must-pass legislation. Many of you will remember this. And so I think it's important, even if the public choice theory can't fully account for the varieties of marijuana experiences and the reasons for them, it shouldn't at least be silent on them. It's not the case that Washington, D.C. has chosen home grow because that's the voter's choice. This is a congressional imposition and intervention on us. So I think that's a qualification that's historically important enough to warrant consideration from the authors. I want to make a larger kind of point about big marijuana, which I think we're very much on the precipice of big marijuana. We are now faced with 2 ballot measures in Western states, and I think if they pass as predicted, we'll be looking at basically a Western regional monopoly on the legalization of marijuana, and that, I think, warrants very serious consideration and attention for us. I share and very much endorse the author's concern that a robust regulatory environment is best maintained by a variety of state experiences, right? And that when we have a monopolization, or if you will, a big marijuana emerging, we can see not just the dangers of special interest capture, but also the dangers that the authors point to, which are more nuanced and very subtle and kind of accumulate over time. Dangers like regulatory incoherence and unwieldy regulations, for instance. I very much endorse and agree with those concerns. I myself would not position the concerns of big marijuana to be solely a function of anti-legalization advocates. I think that there are many advocates for marijuana legalization, myself included, who have concerns about the emergence of big marijuana. And I think in some ways, actually, the anti-legalization advocates are the least desirable representatives for that concern, because many of them actually represent interests which, if they can't be called big marijuana, they can certainly be called big pharma. So I think they are discredited advocates as far as big marijuana is concerned in my eyes. I say all that to dispute and raise some sense of trouble about whether or not leaving marijuana policy to the states is an adequate synonym for decentralization. Decentralization and the kind of prevention of economic concentrations of power is a hallmark of competitive industry in this country. It is also the atmosphere in which robust regulations thrive. I think we should be at the point where we question whether and the degree to which states are an adequate substitute or a synonym for decentralization. I say that as somebody who's not just a historian of the drug war, and we watch uniform criminal codes being implemented and widely accepted across the states in the 1930s, but I also say that as somebody who just reviewed a book on the conservative contribution to criminal justice reform. And in that particular red state criminal justice reform story, we see very much like with marijuana, where Colorado and Washington led the way, we see Texas and Georgia leading the way. And they establish a certain set of best practices, and those best practices get adopted by organizations like ALEC or other kinds of national organizations that then promote those best practices or what they see as best practices, and the other states kind of fall as dominoes. It's not as if each state is independently considering its own indigenous concerns. They're, in fact, very often just adopting the legislative menu. You know, they're ordering from the legislative menu, if you will, that's been already proven and successful and shown to be legitimate in other states. That's always been the case. We've always had that kind of domino effect. We have early innovators and then a domino effect. But I want to raise a particular concern about whether states can be treated as adequate representatives of decentralization in the midst of the kind of economic concentrations of power, the kind of mergers and acquisitions that we've seen in this country unfold since the Reagan administration, and in particular within the last 20 years. I mean, we are living in an unheralded Gilded Age, not just for reasons of economic inequality, but also for reasons of economic concentrations of power. This, I think, suggests that big marijuana might go down that path, but at a minimum, it also suggests that big marijuana will be affected by those economic concentrations of power. For instance, we now live in a world where the US media market is controlled by only 6 companies, right? 6 corporations. As part of that economic consolidation in media, State House reporting has gone down dramatically, right? So Pew Charitable Trust has found that State House reporting has declined over 40% just in the last 10 years. Just literally reporters being taken away from the State House beat. So this suggests in turn that we don't have the same kind of effective monitoring and watchdogs at the individual state level as we used to have. And I raise all this not to begrudge the authors for naming the states as the mechanisms of decentralization. Louis Brandeis long ago suggested that states were the laboratories of democracy. I raise it to raise a larger set of concerns, really. Concerns that might be addressed by this institution and its great talent as well as many others. I think it's worth giving some sense of trouble, some notion of friction as to whether states do indeed operate independently as laboratories of reform. I think initial early innovators do. I think Andrew's experience attests to that. He's clearly been in a honeymoon phase and is establishing best practices that will be replicated, as well as Washington. But I think we should also be attentive to and concerned about the ways in which states often don't enter into independent deliberative processes. They merely adopt, like dominoes, what's gone before them.
Thank you. That's very challenging and important, and a breath of fresh air in many ways. Alex.
So let me tell you what worries me. I'm an economist. I have a kind of a free market leaning, libertarian leaning. And I love capitalism, love markets, love innovation, creative destruction, invisible hand, all that kind of thing. And when I look at the market in Colorado, it's fulfilling, all of my predictions and expectations. That is, we see a price has fallen, we see efficiency has increased, quality of marijuana has increased, the THC content, per leaf has increased. We have a much greater variety. And we have an incredible amount of innovation. We see things, as has already been mentioned, such as the edibles. We see the chocolate. We've gone beyond brownies. We have the chocolate bars. We have gummy bears, all kinds of things like that now. And how people consume marijuana has changed and has innovated. We see sort of marijuana bars like coffee houses where all these different varieties are available, and you can have your marijuana with the different food pairings, high-class, 5-star restaurant marijuana, that sort of thing. We also have, in addition to the edibles, the liquids and the vaporizers that you can put the liquids now with the vape cigarettes, right? A whole new kind of a delivery system, or much improved delivery system. The former CEO, I believe, of Green Mountain Coffee has developed a pod system for marijuana, okay? It doesn't even have to change the name, like Green Mountain would be just as good, right, okay? And so I look at this, and it certainly fulfills all my expectations, and yet in the back of my mind, okay, I'm thinking, capitalism plus an addictive drug, is this really the best combination? I have some fears back there that maybe sometimes efficiency is not actually the best thing. Maybe innovation is in all things is not always good. Perhaps there's some arguments for a government-run system. The Lada was a great car if you didn't want people to go anywhere. And maybe, less innovation in some fields might actually be a good thing. In the end, I don't actually come down on that view. These things worry me. I am worried about them. I don't actually come down on that view. I still think that the benefits outweigh the costs. Arrests, of course, are way down. Arrests for marijuana possession, where it has been legalized, are way down. They're still occurring in much of the rest of the country. Violence is down. It looks even that the violence in Mexico may have decreased because of legalization in parts of the United States. That's a possibility. I don't know if we can prove that yet, but that certainly fits the correlation. So I think overall, I think a lot of good things are going on. In the long run, I expect that there will also be innovations in using marijuana in a responsible way. I think when there's a demand for that, that will happen. I do worry, you look at like the slot machines and how much attention to detail has been put and how much investment has been put into slot machines to make them a super addictive kind of device, and one worries about that. So these things worry me not only because there may be significant costs of marijuana use. Marijuana is great for the middle class in exactly the same way that alcohol is great for the middle class. You can enjoy it on the weekend and so forth, but there is a very large group of alcohol users. In fact, pretty much the majority of the alcohol consumption is used by people who abuse alcohol, and one worries that that can happen with marijuana as well. There is a very large right-hand tail of marijuana use of people who use it every single day. That is a large fraction of the consumption, people who use marijuana every single day. So I worry not only because of these costs, but also because there could be a public backlash. Okay? And overall, I think a backlash would be a negative thing because I think we are moving in the right direction. Nevertheless, could capitalism innovate too much, create a public backlash, and cause the system to be shut down? That's my main worry, not so much the interest groups, but that the marketing and capitalist innovation will create something which we're all going to be a little bit afraid of and will create a public backlash.
So, Alex, one reason I was keen to invite you is to ask you a mischievous question.
Okay.
In the world of public choice, people worry about regulatory capture, where the agencies wind up representing the regulated interests, and they worry about rent seeking, where the regulations wind up building in, large implicit subsidies to existing stakeholders, and barriers to entry and so forth. Is it possible that marijuana is a place where all these bad public choice outcomes are actually a good thing because they will slow down innovation, new entry, and so forth?
Yeah, I think that's true. So, Jim Buchanan, Nobel Prize winner, he once said that the mafia is a good thing because the only thing worse than a monopoly in crime is competitive crime, right? And so if we have a sort of a more monopoly in the marijuana producers, they're going to want to raise the price, which is probably something we want to do anyway, have a reasonably high price, with taxes perhaps. So, raising the price is not all a bad thing. But the problem is I don't think that's going to happen until too late. So those kind of things which you're talking about, that's when the public is no longer paying attention. That's when the rent seekers and the special interest groups and the small changes in the law, that's when those things, the turnover, in between the revolving door between government and the industry, these things take time to develop. And they develop when the public's no longer paying attention. Right now, the public's paying attention, so I think there's less of that. And it's going to take too long before those forces sort of save us, if they would save us.
Terrific. Well, believe it or not, we're already down to 15 minutes. Phil, would you like to respond to anything that's been said before we go to Q&A?
I'll just make one quick point, maybe response to a couple things. Just that, one of our prescriptions that we offer that I didn't mention before is just that states embarking on these experiments should do their best to put in place some information gathering processes that they're going to trust, because part of the difficulty is in just knowing exactly what is happening and being able to look at the whole body of experience, knowing what the status quo was like and how it differs from the legalized regime that comes after, because obviously many of the worries that Alex just raised are worries that apply to marijuana prohibition states. I mean, the kind of use patterns and such. So we need to know how legalization affects it, such that we could tailor the regulatory regime accordingly. And so we do hope that states are thinking about how they can put themselves in a position, not just to be buffeted around by the messages of advocates, but to have some trusted information as they go forward and try to make the best of their regulation.
And Washington State has done that, as you've documented. It's not a theoretical idea. One state has already built in a kind of internal information gathering and baseline building process. So let's go to all you guys. I saw some heads shaking in vigorous disagreement at various stages. So we have a microphone in the back. I think we might also get Twitter questions at some point. I'm going to start in the way back because I can't really. I see a man in a maroon shirt over by the wall. Everybody, we're short on time, so really keep it short or I'll get mean and nasty.
Hi, David Borden with StopTheDrugWar.org. Just a quick reaction to something Professor Tabarrok said. The idea of keeping prices high as something beneficial. I think it may well be that high prices are beneficial, but high prices have their dark side as well. People who are hooked on a substance wind up spending more. Some of the most extreme harms related to addiction to hard drugs are directly tied to the high prices. And with marijuana dependence, people in that situation may spend more than they can afford with all the harms that can go with that. So I'm just raising the question. Are we sure that high prices are the best route to go? That they might not be.
Alex, you want to respond?
I mean, look, there's lots of benefits of low prices. The very first being that, consumers benefit. So, and I don't think we should dispute, and I think we should take these benefits into account. So the marijuana users are the main beneficiaries of marijuana legalization, and those count as real benefits. However, I do worry about the abusers and people, and it's a large share of the market, who use an awful lot of either marijuana or alcohol. And the thing about high prices is it won't dissuade the weekend user, it won't dissuade the casual user because you're only paying this, occasionally, but it may have a bigger effect on the habitual user. And probably that's a good thing. These other things you're talking about, we have other means, other margins on which we can go after those things, criminal law. So I think it's best we focus on the margin of sort of reducing the number of habitual users and deal with the problems of the habitual users with other methods other than price.
I just want to say very, very quickly that we should be distinguishing between high prices as a result of corporate monopoly and high prices at the point of sale. One of the virtues of a low price and competitive market is to make room for state taxation. State taxation is the principal way in which states can regulate marijuana.
And one of the things I think about when we're talking about no federal involvement is we have some pretty strange outcomes already by the way we've done this. I mean, medical marijuana is taxed at 2.9%, recreational somewhere in the 20s and 30s when all is said and done, which actually can serve as a buying in bulk discount. And I'm not sure we're using taxes in all the ways that taxes are supposed to be used in the state of Colorado. And so something interesting to think about of ways in which we don't have the reset buttons to try some of this stuff again and create a unified, more coherent system, especially because it's written into our Constitution.
There was a woman with her hand up for a long time. Your shoulder must be getting sore.
It is. Sharon Bovat, voice of a moderate. The week before the GOP debate in Denver, I went to Colorado, hadn't tried marijuana for over 25 years, and I researched the industry. Great research trip. But what I've learned is 20,000 people a month are moving to Colorado. Violent crime is down. Taught to the police. They said the homeless that have come in are mainly from Texas that just got a jail for drug busts. The homeless actually help the tourists cross the street. My question for you is, when you look at all the problems, you have to look at the good. And when you look at PTSD, and 22 vets a day are dying, and the number was over only 200 in 2008. Now it's every 10 days there's more vets committing suicide. PTSD.
Is there a
my
question
question is that cannabis can be a cure if it's funded for research. And my issue is that a lot of those people moving there are vets.
Can I
And
get you to-
the question
to
is,
put a question mark
is
on it?
high price really that important? It's a plant. People can grow it. Is there any way that everyone can have access to this? Thank you.
Anyone want to respond to that? We can take it as a comment or as a question. Andrew? Yeah.
First, we use some of the fees that have come in from medical marijuana to a PTSD sponsored research. And the second would be, I hope nobody's taking any of my comments to be positive or negative. The model I'm under is totally good governance, and so I'm not here today to go either way on whether or not legalization is a good idea or a bad idea.
Who else? Gentlemen, we'll go male, female. A gentleman about 6 rows from the back.
Hi, my question is, when do you think institutional investors will start getting into the industry, and then how that will affect the lobbying efforts and the opinions of policymakers on the Hill? Thank you.
Now, they're getting in now. So one of the challenges I issue to the authors of this paper is that regulation and decentralization is not just a function of state governance, it's also a function of economic concentrations of power. Washington State is now considering broadening out its investor groups. The investors are coming now. These ownership questions, this honeymoon period that we're in, I think the window is closing. We are now at the precipice of big marijuana, and it's principally because of the question of investors.
Phil? Andrew?
Oh, well, on the other hand, it's because of the federal prohibition that remains in place today. This area presents sort of a special combination of risks to investors, and that has definitely slowed things down and kept it among out of the true financial mainstream, and the banking concerns, of course, are there as well. So I think it's as long as the federal prohibition remains firmly in place, that will really slow things down.
Andrew, we'll have a second panel about investment in corporate marijuana. Is there anything you'd like to say in that specific context of lobbying and investment?
Just an interesting fact is Colorado, the marijuana lobby in Colorado just passed the allowance for out-of-state institutional investors, as well as closely held corporations that are owned entirely by people, are the two that now can invest or will be able to invest in Colorado marijuana.
Who else? The gentleman in the front row has been patient.
Howard Wooldridge with LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition for the Good Professor. Regarding one of the goals of Legalize Regulate was to eliminate the cartels, the illicit market. My brother lives in Norway. A bottle of Jack Daniels will cost you $80. So it has reduced consumption. However, people die every year in Norway from bad Jack Daniels as it's being smuggled from Sweden and Denmark. So I would submit, sir, yes, it sounds great to increase the price so that people smoke less. The trouble is, as you know, you should know, that in New York City today, 40% of cigarettes are from Virginia. So we have a robust black market there. We need to find that sweet spot, and I would urge you to look at it that way, the sweet spot where you can destroy the black market, but not, and find that nice spot where you can do that. I would urge you to look at that as a goal, because the black market employs kids who get shot and killed, et cetera.
Of course, the challenge of the public choice perspective is you can set all the goals you want to. The problem is implementing the goal when you're dealing with many interest groups, rent seekers, and so on. Anyone want to comment on that? No? Thank you for the point. Let's go over here by the fire alarm.
Hi, my name is Ann Wallace, and I'm an independent cannabis blogger. I'm wondering, as I understand your central premise, it is that the decentralization of regulation in some way prevents the concentration of economic power, and hence the discouragement of big marijuana. I wonder if you've considered that, in fact, the reverse might be true, and that, for instance, failure of the federal government to address some questions like the repeal of Section 280 of the Internal Revenue Code, or the failure of amendments for intellectual property law, or the amendments that would be necessary to banking law to permit legal cannabis businesses to have better access to banking. Isn't it possible that failure, in fact, favors the more concentrated power, the deeper pocket?
Well, just to be clear, so I don't think really anybody could look at the legal status quo with federal prohibition and the states going forward and creating these regulatory regime. I don't think anybody could look at that and say that it's optimal in any way. It just, I mean, it's embarrassing as a matter of law. It creates all sorts of logistical problems, all sorts of problems in tax law, like the one you alluded to, that John Hudak has written about. And so, yeah, we certainly don't want to give the impression that we think the ideal situation is just federal prohibition coupled with this state allowance. Rather, we're saying that if we look ahead and think about what a legalized federal regime might look like, we think it makes a lot of sense to treat it like alcohol is treated under the 22nd Amendment, and leaving pretty much all of the decisions up to states rather than making those decisions in Washington. Once you've taken the necessary legal steps to normalize it to some degree as a matter of federal law.
Yeah, the notion here is the federal government federal regulation is one-stop shopping for lobbyists, and very hard to reverse once you go down that road, makes experimentation more difficult. And while taking on board Kathleen's critique as very important, there's no guarantee in the states either. Interstate competition and variety does provide some buffer against a sort of rent-seeking on the national level. We've got another minute. We can do one more question. Let's go to the gentleman by the aisle. Let's bundle the last two. Keep them really short. There's one in the back row. So
okay,
this gentleman, that gentleman, we'll do them both, and then we'll hit them both, and then we'll switch panels.
All right, I'll try to be brief as possible. I'm Eddie Pounds. I'm a Maryland-based lobbyist. And if you're familiar with Maryland, we're in the early stages of implementing our medical cannabis program. Now, our governor, Governor Larry Hogan, is said to be anti-legalization, and partly because of issues he has seen in Colorado. So my question is to Mr. Friedman, if you could hit the reset button, what would you do differently with respect to recreational use?
Hi, I just wanted to ask if anyone in the panel could please address the topic of dosages on medical marijuana and where that stands now in terms of who's developing the regulations and standards, and if there is any kind of unification of that effort.
I'm going to say both of those are for you, Andrew. Good luck.
This is why you paid for a plane ticket, right? So I would say to the first question, lessons learned that I would start differently. And again, this is going to be entirely from a good government standpoint. If I could hit the reset button, the very first thing I would do is put a moratorium on unlicensed growing and run everything through the license system for, I don't know if that's 5 years, I don't know, but we have an economic incentive right now to grow in Colorado and ship to another state, and we have many ways in which that can happen, and it's a little bit like letting Al Capone's men continue to run liquor while you're trying to set up legitimate licensed liquor, and so that would be my absolute number one. The other ones that I would do are kind of less important than that, but first of all, I would start data collection right away. I think one of the reasons there's so many different points of view of how Colorado is going is that we actually weren't collecting a lot of marijuana-specific data before legalization. And so you can say there's been an incredible increase in DUIDs, but we weren't actually enforcing DUIDs all that much before 2014. We wrote a new law on it. And so all of that data is kind of out the window, and it's going to take much longer to get a good grasp on what is happening in complicated public safety and public health situations. The third one I would do is, and this is maybe a little minor but important, is I would take a loan out against your general fund and start public education campaigns right away. I think a lot of what we saw in the first couple of months on this was that people didn't have the culture of responsible use at the beginning. And so I'm pretty proud of our campaign. Good to know it's a campaign that doesn't talk down to people and merely gives them information, but I would have liked to have that a month before or half a year before we ever legalized marijuana. And then minorly, maybe not minorly, I would also think of a moratorium on advertising until we can figure out what responsible advertising looks like as well. To the question on dosing, we've spent a lot more time. Your question was medical marijuana, and the answer is we don't know. Nor do we think we have the resources in Colorado to answer very complex what is helpful amounts, what are side effects, what are beneficial amounts of medical marijuana, and most of that is unfortunately done anecdotally rather than through rigorous science, and that's part of the fact that it's a Schedule I, and a lot of that research can't happen. Most of our dosing, so we now say that 10 milligrams is a quote-unquote dose, and you can only have 10 milligrams per product, or that it's clearly demarcated and stamped if it's more than one dose, has to do more with what would be a bad experience for a marijuana-naive user. And so that dosing is, if you have 10 milligrams and you're a marijuana-naive user, most of our pretty informal studies show you're not going to have a bad experience with that.
Please join me in thanking our panelists. Andrew will stay with us. I hope you folks will stay long enough to take questions if they come up.